Hello, everyone. Welcome to Detecting Dementia, Technology, Access, and the Law. This is part of the project on Law and Applied Neuroscience, a collaboration between the Center for Law, Brain, and Behavior at Massachusetts General Hospital and the Petrie-Flom Center for Health Law Policy, Biotechnology, and Bioethics at Harvard Law School. This is a longstanding collaboration of several years that is committed to bringing some really interesting discussions on the state of neuroscience and technology, as well as the impact that it should have on law and regulation, as well as how law and regulation can shift and change now that we understand neuroscience, the brain, and frankly ourselves better. My name is Carmel Shachar. I am the Executive Director of the Petrie-Flom Center. I am delighted to welcome you to this event. First, a few housekeeping items, kind of the equivalent of me telling you where the bathrooms are if this was an in-person event. We are going to welcome audience questions. We have a really significant and what I hope will be juicy and exciting moderated discussion to end this event. So please send us your questions. How do I do that, you might be asking? You have two ways to do that. The first and best way is to go and use the Zoom Q&A feature, which if you scroll down to the bottom of the Zoom is available. If you submit your question there, I and the Petrie-Flom staff will be monitoring it and we will be pulling questions to ask. You can also join us on Twitter by using the hashtag Detecting Dementia. Again, that's hashtag Detecting Dementia. If you join the conversation there and you have a question, we'll pull that question from Twitter and put it into the Zoom Q&A so that I can ask our panelists that question. Ways that you cannot submit a question. The little blue Zoom raise hand feature is very cute, but we will not be monitoring it. Likewise, you won't be able to use the chat to submit questions. Housekeeping over, I want to say that the question of how we use technology to detect dementia earlier and earlier is an incredibly important and impactful one for people who ultimately will be living with dementia as well as their family. Myself, I have a grandmother who passed away this spring who had developed dementia, and because of where her family lived, she had one daughter who lived close to her and saw her every day, and so it was really difficult for her to realize that her mother had gone far enough that she wasn't able to take care of her own affairs the way that she had previously. And she had one daughter who lived on a different continent who just didn't see her often enough to realize how far things had progressed. It meant that there was a really significant scramble to get her affairs in order when she was still able to participate in that process. And it meant that creating a care plan and creating a plan for what the next few years would look like had to be extremely rushed. What we're going to be discussing are technologies, advances in neuroimaging, genetics, mobile health apps that create unprecedented opportunities to detect subtle brain changes that may predict the onset of Alzheimer's disease and other types of dementia. As I think about this, I can't help but think about what advance notice might have done, both to help my grandmother achieve everything that she would have wanted to achieve in her final years, as well as to help her daughters and their family prepare, both in terms of the legal, financial, care logistics, but also emotionally for what happened with the final years of her life. With that personal story to set the table, I'm excited to introduce the panel. I will be introducing all three right now so that we have the smoothest transition. First, we have Itzit Bahia, Medical Director, Geriatric Psychiatry Outpatient Services at McLean Hospital and the McLean Institute for Technology in Psychiatry. Then we will have Jonathan Jackson, Founding Director, Community Access Recruitment and Engagement, Research Center at Massachusetts General Hospital and Harvard Medical School. And last but absolutely not least, Bruce Price, co-founder and co-director of Massachusetts General Hospital Center for Law, Brain, and Behavior. With that said, Ipsit, I believe that you are up first. Please take it away.
Can everyone hear me and see my slide? Excellent. Thanks for that kind introduction, and thanks for having me participate in this panel. Such a distinguished group of people, and I'm honored to not just be here, but also lead this off. So I was really struck by the story you shared, Carmel, because I think so much of what we do is driven by, in the end, the personal story or a personal experience around dementia that really exposes all of the various gaps we have in the science and in the way we provide care. My own work comes from such a story, and I'm going to be sharing a couple of case scenarios of people I've worked with. Just to quickly go through my disclosures, I may mention a brand or a company or two since I do tech work, but there's no conflicts of interest anywhere there. There's a few different ways of thinking about technology and how it pertains to dementia care. The topic itself is, I think, long enough to merit a 1-hour symposium all of its own. So it's a challenge having to pick enough to keep it to 10 minutes or so. But what I want to talk about today is the idea of the phenotype, which 8th grade biology tells us is the outward appearance of an organism. And where we've moved with this now is, in the last 5 years or so, we work with something called the digital phenotype. Now, this is defined as the moment-by-moment quantification of the individual level human phenotype, so appearance, if you will, in situ, using data from personal digital devices. Now, the world of dementia detection is a broad one. There's technologies being used to expedite how we process neuroimaging, how we process genetic information, or how we conduct neuropsychological testing remotely. I'm going to talk about something a little bit different. I'm going to talk about how we measure behavior, and I hope to make the case at the end that cognition is sort of the signature domain of dementia, but really it's the behavioral symptoms and the behavioral phenomena around it that can be a precursor to the condition, can be a part of the condition, but can also be a highly distressing sequel to the condition of having dementia. So let's talk about a case. Mrs. E is an 85-year-old woman who resides at an assisted living facility in the Metro Boston region. She has a diagnosis of major neurocognitive disorder, mixed type, and comorbid with MDD, which is major depressive disorder, and generalized anxiety disorder. I happen to be her treating psychiatrist. Now, when I see Mrs. E at the assisted living facility that she lives in once every 2 weeks or so, I am wholly beholden to what the staff tell me about her. And typically, if I go in and I ask, how is Mrs. E doing? The answer is 2 words: she's all right, or she's fine. And one tends to go with the flow in these scenarios. We're all busy. One morning I got paged at about 7 in the morning, just letting me know that Mrs. E had been hospitalized to the McLean Geriatric Psychiatry Unit. And I was surprised, and I said, why? And they're like, oh, she punched a peer in the face at breakfast. And my reaction was, what the heck happened? Now, it's not unknown that people have random episodes of violence that are not easy to predict in dementia. But she had some history of pacing, occasional restlessness, and agitation. Now, these symptoms matter because these are the symptoms that are primary drivers of mortality. So we think of dementia care as the early detection piece, where you pick it up and you can do preventative intervention. But there's an equally important late dementia care piece. And if we were to find a way to stop the disease in its tracks today, there would still be the 50-odd million people that have the disease that we would have to deal with these sequelae. So some of what I will be talking about will be this late stage dementia care. My question though was, is there a way that you can monitor some of these people or get data that lets you see what's happening in real time, pick up on behavior change, and preempt some of these decompensations around hospitalization? So the nice thing about being in Boston is MIT is around the corner. And we started talking to people there, and we identified a device that was being built in the computer sciences lab. It's called the Emerald. It's a very non-specific looking white box seen in this picture that plugs into the power main, but it does something interesting. It emits radio wave signals. It's about 1/100th the wavelength of typical Wi-Fi, so it's safe. And it can track the way these signals bounce off a body, including a human body. And based on this, it functions a little bit like sonar, and it lets you extract behavioral parameters. So here's a quick video clip that demonstrates what this does. You can see our grad student volunteer walking on a spiral on the floor. And in the bottom left of the screen, the red dot represents what the device sees. Now, what's nice about this is that it's completely contact-free and interaction-free. Nothing needs to be worn, nothing needs to be charged. The gray arrow actually points to the location of the device, and you can see it's not there because it's on the other side of the wall. Because like Wi-Fi, it can penetrate walls. So it's incredibly easy to use from the dementia sufferer's perspective. We deployed this device in the living environment of Mrs. E. And here's, oh, I'm sorry. I'll play oh, hang on. I lost the plot a little bit there. You can see now the floor plan of her room. The red dot here is Mrs. E. We're going to view a little clip of her activity starting at about 1:46 p.m. You can see her walking into her room now. De-identified at source means that if you didn't know who this was, you would not know who this was. So one of the most appealing things about this technology is that it preserves confidentiality. Now, no one has time to sit and watch somebody all day. That would be prohibitively expensive. Now, because it's digital, you can speed up the recording, and you can see that now she's in the hallway. We isolated the frame just to her room so that you can't see the other peers in the living environment. So it's to protect their privacy. You will see her coming back. She sits on her bed. When she's still, the red dot disappears. When she moves, you can see it coming back. If you're watching the clock, you've now seen her go in and out of her room 2 times in about 7 minutes. There she's back again. In the interest of time, I won't play the whole clip, but I will give you the spoiler. In about 75 seconds, you see her going to the bathroom. But what this demonstrates here is classic pacing behavior. Someone that's walking in and out, sitting on the bed, going out, about 5 visits in and out in 10 minutes. When you aggregate this data over 24-hour periods, you can see patterns. This, for example, is a low activity day in Mrs. E's life versus a high activity day. So you can track trends of overall behavior. And we're now starting to understand that when you can track behavior over time, dense data let you pick up on subtleties that you can't pick up on otherwise. And once you start to do that, it gets disruptive in a good way. So this, for example, is how the DSM-5 and the ICD allow us to diagnose or document diagnosis of behavioral disturbances. They don't let you make out any differences. It's just one big category. So if you wanted to do a retrospective chart review, for example, you're probably in trouble because pacing, anxiety, agitation, and apathy and hypersomnia are all coded the exact same way. But that's not how we operate as clinicians. So here's a different way of looking at data from this device. This is the data from a 75-year-old man with vascular dementia who had hypersomnia and anxiety. In this figure, it's made up of about 90 concentric circles, each of which represents a 24-hour period in the life of a patient. So what you're really looking at is all of the movement this person made in their room in 3 months. It's an extraordinary amount of information. We apply machine learning to data from the Emerald, and it can tease out various activity patterns. So you can see this person, for example, goes to bed at about 8 p.m., wakes up at about 8 a.m., fairly uniform sleep. Then there's this little white, what we call the breakfast slice. They come back, and there's a lot of gray in the late morning period when this person is again sleeping in bed. Then there's a little lunch slice, some more time spent in the bed, and then they're out of their room in the evening. Contrast this with a different person, 85-year-old woman with Alzheimer's disease, pacing, and a severely disrupted circadian rhythm. What you see are circles of gray alternating with circles of white. This is someone that has sometimes entire days spent in bed, followed by entire days when this person is not in her bed at all. You can also see a lot of blue here, which is time when she's sitting in her bed or sleeping in her bed and awake. A very different phenotype than the first person we saw. Contrast this with a third patient that has an 86-year-old woman with Parkinson's disease, has dementia, in this case, psychomotor retardation and apathy. A beautiful sleep-wake cycle, but lots of green, which is time spent just sitting in her chair in her room, inactive. As per our current nosology, all three of these people carry the exact same diagnosis, even though they look nothing alike. So this is an example of how access to phenotypic data, I'm giving the example of the behavior phenotype, but colleagues in imaging will tell you that you can pick up on subtle signals with rich imaging data. When you correlate that with information like this, as well as sophisticated cognitive testing, and there isn't time to talk about all of this, what we're ending up with is very rich phenotypes that you can triangulate or quadrangulate to have much more precise diagnosis and much more precise characterization. This device alone can let you pick up gait speed, gait patterns, so where someone is in the room, spatial location, time spent asleep and awake. It can even pick up stages of sleep, position, so whether someone's standing, sitting, or sleeping. And when someone is asleep, then based on chest wall movements, it can actually map out the respiratory rate. And we're now using this to study COVID-19 and dementia without anyone having to interact. So well thought out, well deployed technology combined with good clinical perspective is going to be a true paradigm shift. To the extent that if you look at how we've developed behavior models using mice moving around in these open fields. All of these red lines are just mouse models. We can now actually do the same with human beings. When you consider that so much of our drug development is based on these mouse models of behavior, if you could do that with human beings, it's put us on the brink of thinking of motion mapping in humans as sort of the next great biomarker in psychiatry and neurology and behavioral neuroscience more broadly. I do want to stop though and pause just to talk about the issue of data security and privacy. And I know some of that will come up. With great power comes great responsibility, as Marvel comics have taught us. And we have to be conscious of how we use and store these data. This was a different study just looking at dementia apps. And I'm going to give you the quick key points. In this study, we reviewed all the apps on the App Store that involved people with dementia or caregivers putting in active data. And we saw that 80% of them actually were going to share the data with business partners or third parties. 80%. 96% either said that they would sell data in an acquisition or they did not specify. And we took the stance of assuming if they did not specify, then they were probably going to sell the data. 36% actually did not tell you for sure that you could amend your data or delete your data. There's a whole can of worms here, but because this is the Petrie-Flom Center, I would be failing in my duty if I didn't at least raise the issue of being able to collect and use the data for clinical applications is one thing, but we have a responsibility to keeping safe custody of incredibly private information as well. I'll stop here and I look forward to discussing this further. Thank you for your time and attention.
Thanks, Ipsit. Next, we will have Jonathan Jackson.
Okay, hi everybody. Ipsit, that's a tough act to follow. That's really absolutely fascinating. You know, these really novel ways of digital phenotyping. So I don't have any slides, so you can either look at my face or look out the window or daydream, but I'm just gonna talk to you. So today we're here to talk about this idea or this process of detecting dementia. and ultimately what the acceleration of neuroimaging and epigenomics and also digital phenotyping technologies might mean in a legal context. And we know that this context of legalities is already tricky because we're here to determine, or because we have to determine and establish things like competence, agency, and sound-mindedness. Already, the problem of dementia. But we have to remember that it is really, really vital to continually ask ourselves, detecting dementia for whom and under what contexts? Meaning that we have to think proactively here and now in this 1 hour that we've got about the ethics and equity of our solutions. And it really starts with a simple question: what's dementia? And if you don't mind, to answer that question or to illustrate the problems of that question, I'm going to tell you a story. Now, you might have missed it because some other stuff was going on, but 10 days ago, on November 6th, the FDA Peripheral and Central Nervous System Drugs Advisory Committee met to discuss the first ever disease-modifying therapy submitted for approval for Alzheimer's disease, and this is aducanumab. Now, keep in mind that that it's been around 17 years since a new drug has been approved for Alzheimer's disease, and even these previous approvals were only for treating symptoms. So it's basically like taking a flu medicine that makes you feel better but doesn't actually attack the virus. So this is so it's been a while, and the stuff that we've already got doesn't seem to work very well for a lot of people. Now, not only that, aducanumab had a wild ride to even get this far, to get to this committee. So this is the Alzheimer's drug that completely danced through early stage clinical trials, and people called it a miracle drug. And then in March of 2019, it spectacularly failed in a late stage clinical trial, and studies were halted because researchers just didn't see any sign of efficacy. And then after that, months later, scientists did something that made people's jaws just drop, hit the floor. They resurrected the study's findings, and then they claimed that this drug, aducanumab, did in fact treat Alzheimer's disease, and that they were going to seek FDA approval based on the study that technically failed. So fast forward to 10 days ago, we're on the threshold of something big, maybe a game changer. Now, of course, the committee that met on the 6th, that met 10 days ago, doesn't determine whether the FDA will or won't approve the drug, but it's usually a really good indicator about whether the drug works as intended, and FDA often follows its advice in making a decision. The meeting that I'm talking about lasted hours. It was live streamed, but so many people were tuning in that hundreds, thousands of people couldn't even get into the virtual broadcast. In the end, the committee was asked to vote on 4 questions about aducanumab, this Alzheimer's drug that could change the way that we see the disease and dementia forever. After years of preparation, thousands of pages of documents, hours of testimony, it came down to just 4 questions. And it's the responses to those questions that tell us exactly where the future of detecting dementia is going. Now, if you'll humor me, I'm going to walk you through all 4. Question number 1, do the original analyses, before they resurrected the study, do the original analyses demonstrate that aducanumab effectively treats Alzheimer's disease? No, according to the committee, no. Okay, question 2, do the new analyses done after the study was halted demonstrate that aducanumab effectively treats Alzheimer's disease? No, again, said the committee. Oh, okay. Question 3, taken together, do all of the analyses, old and new, original and refreshed, demonstrate that aducanumab effectively treats Alzheimer's disease? Absolutely not, said the committee. All right, question 4, does aducanumab have an effect on the underlying Alzheimer's disease pathophysiology? It's tricky, but I think so, said the committee. So hang on a second there. What does that mean? What does that mean? The committee was asked if this drug could treat Alzheimer's disease, and they said no in 3 different ways. But then they're asked in the same meeting if the same drug has an effect on the fundamental biological indicators of Alzheimer's disease, and they said, yeah, I think so. Now, it seems subtle, but it turns out that this completely and perfectly encapsulates a long simmering debate in the field of Alzheimer's disease. And without resolving it, we risk carrying this messiness over into technological and legal implications of what it means to even detect dementia. Here's the debate in a nutshell. When we detect dementia, we're trying to measure it or cure it or develop legal standards for capacity over it. Do we rely on behavioral signs of dementia, the forgetting and the getting lost and the personality changes, or do we rely on stuff that we can measure in the brain, the amyloid plaques, the tau tangles, the atrophy of neurons? So do we base dementia, in other words, on the brain or on the mind? Now, we could wait for those behavioral changes, but they come on slowly over years, and lots could be at risk before we notice. And we know that these changes might also not be specific to dementia. Or we could rely on signals from the brain, measurable years or decades before the behavioral changes. But those brain signals aren't very precise in picking up future cognitive problems in many cases. Now, we know that changes in cognition don't seem to be correlated with those amyloid plaques at all, even though amyloid is one of the earliest changes in the brain that we can reliably tie to Alzheimer's disease. Now, this dividing line between Alzheimer's biomarkers and Alzheimer's disease itself, which includes those thinking and behavior changes, is why the FDA committee responded the way that it did. Aducanumab sure can clear out those amyloid plaques, but it doesn't seem like doing that improves cognition much at all. If we were detecting dementia, say for legal purposes, based on that response, where do we draw the line? Now, if you're still with me, it gets a little trickier when you start to look at marginalized and minoritized groups. So for example, Black people, especially Black people descended from enslaved Africans here in the United States, are 2 to 4 times as likely to develop dementia as whites. But if you look at the plaques and tangles in the brain, well, sometimes there's roughly the same amount in Black brains as white brains. Sometimes there's less of it in Black brains. But you know what? We never see more of it. We're at a point where a behavioral definition of dementia points us in one direction in terms of risk based on race, while a brain-based definition points us in the other direction. And if you're not feeling that things are murky enough, when it comes to groups at differential risk, like certain racial and ethnic minorities, we simply don't have enough data in the world of academic medicine to be sure of what we're seeing. We might be attributing some of these group differences to race when it may be a byproduct of societal factors that shapes who even comes into our studies. And there's a great paper by Carrie Gleason, published about a year ago, that shows exactly this happening in our largest studies of detecting dementia. When it comes to advancing medical research, the US in particular has a long history of abuse, of simultaneously exploiting marginalized populations for advancement and then carrying out generations of neglect as these same technologies benefited more privileged members of society. So typically, and this is where it's crucial, this is most often evident in whatever technology was most advanced at the time. As we developed understanding of radiation, for example, we experimented upon prisoners, our own Japanese American citizens, the heads of hundreds of Black children. We honed our current approaches for diverse research engagement in Macon County, Alabama, in the fields of Tuskegee, under the presumption of studying untreated syphilis. And yes, we have wielded medicalized nomenclature of the brain to reinforce systems of abuse. So has anyone heard the terms drapetomania or dysesthesia ethiopica? These are invented psychiatric disorders that would cause an enslaved African to be lazy or run away. The technological solution at the time beat them, but only sometimes. And in extreme cases, cut off the big toes of each foot. Another example, some of you may have heard the terms, and maybe have used the terms, idiot or moron. Now, these weren't developed with the intent of being weaponized against people of color, but nevertheless, they were utilized in legal settings to destabilize civil rights efforts for decades, and to force sterilization of women of color, quite possibly to the present day. So if we're to learn from our own history, we have to acknowledge that the wrong kind of bias, however we choose to define the term, is almost certain when it comes to detecting dementia. We have to work from the perspective that however well-intentioned we are, the odds are overwhelmingly against us, developing a bias-free instrument, device, or algorithm. We're on the cusp of repeating history once more by failing to appreciate who will be affected as we apply what seem like minor academic nuances of dementia to these robust legal and technological systems. We have to ensure that there are always three things as we begin to lean more heavily on tools and legal precedents to determine where dementia rests in our society: fidelity, accountability, and transparency. So for example, when we talk about measures of accountability and transparency in particular, for whom do we mean and when? The only way forward in all three arenas of law, medicine, and technology is to design as inclusively as possible and to incorporate the voices and perspectives of marginalized communities at every decision point. So that means redefining and appreciating expertise from overlooked sectors like people living with dementia or folks who bear an unusually high risk of the disease. But most of all, we can't exclude these folks from the medical and technical advances that shape how we detect dementia and then disproportionately burden these same communities as we leverage these sectors to advance legal precedent. That's not a matter of goodwill or social justice. Ultimately, we have to continually examine the fidelity, accountability, and transparency of our work through this lens to ensure that we're being ethical and ensure that we're being both ethical and equitable, but mainly because this is how we develop, advance robust and fair systems. And so with that said, that's my time, and I'm going to turn things back over to our moderator to introduce our illustrious final speaker. Thank you.
Thank you, Jonathan. I think that was an incredibly important perspective. Closing out the presentation will be Bruce Price. Bruce?
So thank you, Ipsit. Thank you, Jonathan. Tour de force. Sets me up quite nicely. So appreciated for both of you. And no disclosures. I thought I'd use my 10 minutes to begin with the broad sweep of science. Are we screen sharing or not? I can see my slides. Next slide, please. Yeah, science, how it works. Bullet number one, there are a few simple explanations in science. Alzheimer's is classic for this. First described by Alzheimer in 1907 in a 51-year-old woman at onset. Mind you, the average lifespan at the turn of the century, 1900, was 50. So that was an old woman by those standards. In the 1970s is when it became known as a rather common disorder, particularly linked with aging, and the amyloid and tau, misfolded proteins began to be, seemed to be determining the disease. The question remains, 2020, is that what set the house on fire, or is that the charred remains of the fire? And it's a big question out there. Over 400 failed clinical trials. We need new hypotheses, and Jonathan, you set up the paradigm, the paradox of the Biogen drug quite nicely. We have no disease-modifying medication for Alzheimer's disease at this point in time. So research can be misperceived as an endless cauldron of turmoil, doubts, uncertainties, yet these qualities are essential to the discovery process. I think sometimes this befuddles the public, like, why is it taking so damn long for all these things to happen? So there's two quotes that I like: no paradox, no progress. And the good thing about science is it looks to be agnostic if you use it well, and it looks to be universal. And I like this third bullet. Research represents the rare balance between imagination and critical thinking that tells us whether a good story rises to truth. And the ultimate worth of science is how much can it contribute to the world? And here we are today with looking at AD in society context, ethics, technology, legal, public policy, and on and on. And that's why I think it's very important to have this conference today. Next slide, please. So this is a race against time, the heterogeneous pathways of cognitive aging. So better than average, we now call that super aging. That's meant to make people feel good. And perhaps the vast majority in this audience are super agers, but the reality is 10 to 20% of us are super agers, meaning we age, yet with extraordinary memories, no major declines, highly functional in our later years, 70s, 80s, and 90s. Then we come to normal aging. And again, it's a fuzzy term. What exactly is normal aging? But some degree of age-related decline. And you see the graph falling off and going south on the bottom left. Mild cognitive impairment, now known as minor neurocognitive disorder. Accelerated cognitive decline, but not yet hitting the independent activities of daily living. And then we come to pathologic aging, dementia, the Greek word for out of mind. Next slide, please. So progression of Alzheimer's disease. Alzheimer's represents about 70% of all dementias. So we use this as a model for other diseases as well. Two main things. It looks like, looking at spinal fluid, we can identify those who are at significant risk for developing Alzheimer's 15 years perhaps and more before the clinical onset. And the idea is there that gives us an extraordinary window, pre-symptomatic here. If we can detect earlier, if we can intervene earlier, can we bend the curve and can we better the outcome? Next. So this pertains to IPS. It's a really good lecture because these are early probable neuropsychiatric symptoms that could help us as a precursor to these diseases. And notice this, this list on the right, and apathy is probably the one. It's a very subtle over years, but it's kind of loss of motivation, loss of completion of tasks, a bit indifference, loss of spontaneity, of generous, loss of spontaneous interests. But look at these: sleep, apathy, depression, agitation, hallucinations. These are all really ripe for technologic intervention early on in the disease and for monitoring the disease over time. And then next, please. So read the second line down. The prevalence of dementia essentially doubles every 5 years after the age of 65. That's a big fact. Next. So this is interesting. Women are at higher risk for Alzheimer's disease. A bit controversial, but still I think accepted as fact. Very interesting to me is regardless of economic bracket, education, or geography, it looks like women inherently on average live 5 years longer than men. The only species, the human species, that has this rather severe 5-year difference regardless. So the exciting question to me is, what's up? You know, what's the mechanism? What's the biology? What's the psychology of this? And we're just scratching the surface of that. The other interesting thing to me about this graph is as women age, they ascend in terms of risk. It's rather Darwinian. If men can suffer the vicissitudes of aging, they flatten the curve out around 85 or 90. And so their incidence actually doesn't get that much higher. Next slide. So as Jonathan said, prevalence of AD 2 to 3 times higher amongst Blacks, probably at least, than non-Hispanic whites. Variables include, and these are things that we haven't studied yet, right? This disease was characterized 113 years ago, and we have not looked at these things. Genetics, social, political, economic factors, vascular risk factors, including overweight, obesity, diabetes. By the way, diabetes type 2 automatically doubles your risk for Alzheimer's disease, hypertension, and the diagnosis and control of those factors. Black Americans look like they're less likely to go to a doctor's office to get help with memory problems, and it may well be steeped in the history that Jonathan presented. Hesitant to participate in research trials, institutional credibility, and public trust in science. All credible questions, all somewhat under attack. If we practice science well, I think it's one of the great liberators of humanity. So please don't lose faith. Next. So percentage change in selected causes of death between 2000 and 2015. We're beginning to reduce breast cancer as a cause of death, though only 1% over these 2 decades. Prostate cancer, a little bit better. Heart disease, better. Stroke, even better. Again, controlling these vascular risk factors. HIV is the public health a miracle, if you will, of the last 30 or 40 years. If you are born HIV positive today, and you have access to the medications and you take them reliably, you can live an average span of life. Stunning, stunning to me. Alzheimer's, well, we're shooting up and it's only going to get worse as we age. And the question I have, it's a sociologic ethical question, is that you really want us old folks, gray old folks around living longer and healthier? Think of it. I'm just taking the reverse side just to be provocative, but the economic burden, the family burden, the employment burden. In Europe, where academia is a little bit more hierarchical and stiff, you kind of have to wait for your boss to die before you assume the position of leadership. And so there's a kind of a dark humor there that says in death lies hope. Think about that. And then coronavirus. We could all talk for hours on coronavirus, but it's a catastrophe in the making, largely preventable in many ways. Next slide. I want to end on some good news. If you look at all these age groups, the trend is downward. There's probably a 10 to 20% decrease in Alzheimer's incidence over the last 20 years or so. And this is just data up until 2000, well, it's up to, yeah, it's fairly modern. So, and that's probably due to the intervention with vascular disease with success, the hypertensions, the statins of the world. So it is trending downward. Some people purport, I think this is a little shaky though, and a little premature, that lifestyle factors themselves, sleep, hygiene, diet, exercise, engagement, might reduce up to 40%. Stay tuned. But there is some hope in all this. And the next slide. So I'm going to condense this briefly. So the idea is, can we detect anatomic changes in the brain years and years and years before we can detect specific cognitive and behavioral functions? Memory, executive functions, attention span, psychiatric neurobehavioral symptoms. So we think we have a prediction of what a super aging person's brain looks like. With normal aging, again, as I said, it's a very fuzzy border. What is pushing the boundary upwards of normal, and when does it become a cognitive disorder? We probably have the ability now, with elderly people, and they go in to get their hips repaired. So they have the surgery, they have the medications, they have the anesthesia. Half of them probably, if you did a really formal testing, would be wildly confused, delirious. It's not done. It's the legal problem as well as the ethical problem, I think. But it looks like we can maybe determine who might have underlying Alzheimer's disease. And those are the people with post-op delirium that actually don't recover. Those that don't recover, but as elders over time. The question is, again, can it add to our pre-symptomatic armamentarium? And here's to be answered. Will it help us with prognosis? Understand, I've had patients who have died within 5 years. I have patients still living after 20 to 25 years. So there's a lot of heterogeneity here. Can we monitor interventions and blood tests, which are probably less costly, easier, more accessible? Is that the key to early identification? And finally, next slide, please. So complexities challenged. I won't take you through this list other than the numbers, bullets 3 and 4. Transposing group data to individual patient predictions is very tricky. Always is. And there are always issues of sensitivity, specificity, heterogeneity that I think Jonathan outlined. Cost, access, who do you trust, why, and absolutely lack of racial diversity in research. And finally, next slide, sorry. Slide before. That was 2 slides, yeah. Current investigations. So some people are saying really the origin of the degeneration is that the synapses, which is kind of the cable networks, which interlock neurons. There's a new protein out there that looks to interlock Lou Gehrig's disease, amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, and this frontotemporal dementia, which is in the top 5 in terms of commonplace dementias anymore. What's the role of vascular disease? What's the role of chronic inflammation, both in psychiatric disease, by the way, as well as in Alzheimer's? What about lifestyle factors? We say, we parade, if you just do this, things will go down. True? False? And if it works, why? Mindfulness, which is an interesting take on this whole thing. They're teaching a lot of people mindfulness, and there's a current funded study. Does that bend the curve in the right direction or not? And finally, the application of artificial intelligence. You get billions of points of data, and out of that, you look for pattern matching. So that's the current and future investigations. And I believe the final slide is my way of saying, I think all three of us, I hope, filled your think tank with thoughts. And now for the robust discussion. Thank you.
Thanks, Bruce. So our first question is an audience submitted question, which raises the question of consent in the context of using new technologies. This is a patient population where capacity to consent can be difficult to evaluate and determine. How does the panel think that we should approach consent in terms of using some of the monitoring technology, for example, that Ipsit talked about in his presentation?
I can start with that, though I'm curious about what Jonathan and Bruce have to say. But I think the three-word short answer to that would be with maximum transparency. It is tricky. And I think as technology and data collection gets more intrusive, if you will, I think the onus is on us to try and educate anyone that's enrolled in a study of this kind as to what exactly we're doing. I think the issue of capacity becomes a little trickier. In the work that we do, for example, we rely on proxy consent even for people that may ostensibly have the technology. That way it's sort of the consenting equivalent of two-factor authentication. We ask a patient as well as a healthcare proxy or a designated caregiver to co-sign the informed consent form with them to make sure that two people have independently had a chance to understand it. I think it gets much thornier around research that involves tapping into existing data streams, like say text messaging, if people use natural language processing to look for cognitive variables, where we don't think about the implications of what someone researching our text message content is going to make of it when we send a text message. And yet that's one avenue of phenotyping research that's coming into vogue, where what does consent even really mean? Because when the data were generated, consent was not a factor. So I think it's highly complex. I doubt we're going to come to a reasonable answer in the next 10 minutes or so. But in the end, I think whether this domain of research sinks or swims will depend more or less entirely on whether we figure out how to deal with consent, privacy, and data security.
Yeah, thanks, Bruce. I'll jump in with just a brief answer. I think it's going to require further monitoring and consideration of maybe sort of these dual consent assent models that Ipsit was talking about, that two-factor authentication. And so when we are dealing with other populations in the research world that may have limited agency or capacity, there's usually what we see is like a sliding scale where, if, for example, if you do research in children, if the child is very young, then you really engage with the parents more, and then you engage with the child increasingly as they mature. And then, as the child enters, either puberty or adolescence and then young adulthood, you start to interact with the parents a little bit less and the child a little bit more. So you've got this sliding scale of trying to, based on the capacity that we think a kid has around that time. I think that paired with Ipsit's thought about significant data transparency is probably the best starting place. But then I think that there are really exciting new models of what consent can look like, especially for communities that are a little bit more tightly knit, or where family and medical decisions are made at different units rather than an individual or an individual and their care partner. So starting to incorporate the family or even local community into that decision, sounds a little bit wild to those of us who are used to kind of American life that is very focused on individuals. But for more collectivist cultures, this is actually the way to go. So we need to be thoughtful about starting to explore models of consent that incorporate different actors contributing to the process.
Right, I'm time aware, so I'll answer very briefly. One of our four major thrusts of our Center for Law-Brain Behavior is exactly this. We call it protecting the elderly. And it has to do with cognitive capacity, in legal terms, testamentary capacity, and it has to do with undue influence, which is huge. As you know, it's $1 billion industry. Wills, estates, are you competent? Do you really understand? Do you have inside awareness, concern? Are you able to see consequence of what you're about to sign? I would direct you to our website, clbb.org, because we have a number of lectures on this, but it is tricky. What you need is inside awareness, concern. You need memory. I mean, it's if the brain were to light up for a complex decision-making paradigm, it would light up in so many ways, and you're so dependent on so many intact functions that beware. There is a professor, he's a J.D. neuropsychologist at the University of Alabama, Birmingham, who actually has a set of specific questions regarding level of complexity, named Dr. Marsden. I think it's Marsden, and I would refer you to him as well.
Thank you. And Jonathan, your comment about taking into account cultural approaches to decision-making reminds me of a previous talk that the Petrie-Flom Center hosted on how New Zealand deals with patient data after death, and the approach that they took, which was one approach for the European-based population, but a different culturally informed approach for people of Maori descent. I also want to build on what Bruce, and I think the entire panel was talking about, where the idea of consent and capacity in law, perhaps I'm reducing this a little bit too much, but it seems to be a binary. Either you are competent to consent to take charge of your affairs, to set a will, etc., or you are not. How do you think these new technologies and this new understanding of dementia should affect that model of consent, and where would you hope that the law would take consent in the future?
I defer, and then I'm happy to jump in.
Sure. So with the caveat that as a clinician, I'm not an expert on how laws develop. I would say that some of the classical principles are what I want to go back to, and I think it served us well when we wrestle with complicated issues. So with respect for autonomy, with respect for not doing harm, and I think that's where it gets complicated around data, because the data themselves are agnostic. It kind of comes down to what the data are going to be applied for. So I think for it to be application based and for an understanding of what will be done with those data, and more importantly, I think without jeopardizing accidental loss of autonomy through data theft or data sale. Because this work is so complicated, it's highly interdisciplinary. It's not like a clinician in their office with a file that they can protect. There's the question of, how many outside vendors are there? How many analytic teams come in? Where are the data stored? Who owns all of this? Who controls all of this? So I think the law has a long way to go, but it should probably start with a recognition and an acknowledgement of just how complex and multifaceted this work is, and then figure out how it can all be sort of brought under the same umbrella. I don't know if that answers the question in the way you were hoping for, Carmel, but that's my best shot at it.
No, go ahead, Bruce. I know that your thoughts are more cogent than mine.
Ready to jump. First of all, there are some studies which suggest that elder Black folks are far more prone to exploitation, and that needs to be pursued, obviously, at the level of equity. For now, I think it's good old-fashioned cognitive assessment, kind of looking at so-called executive functions at the moment. And again, Professor Marsden has given us some very good examples. So one of the things we do when there are big transactions and businesses are being passed or merged or acquired and so forth, is actually to look at that time, in real time, the capacity of that person who made the decisions. And, you know, I don't think any brain structure or any genetics, anything else suffices to date for if you give the proper questions, the proper assays, you can make a decision as to at what level can a complex decision be made with competence or not. Oh.
So, Jonathan, the last question is going to be directed to you. You spoke in your presentation about how the behavioral and the biological definitions of Alzheimer's and dementia might diverge. When I heard about that, I thought about some of the fights over medical necessities that have come up with certain medications, most notably with hepatitis C drugs coming out, being expensive, not necessarily being covered. Do you think that this divergence in definitions might be used to deny certain patients access to new expensive medications? And if so, which communities do you expect to see impacted by that?
Yeah, so I know that we're over time, but you know, historical precedent across technology, law, and medicine would indicate that wherever direction we end up going, the groups that are historically most vulnerable in one sector are likely to be exploited in another sector. So, you know, for example, if we end up with a purely biological definition of dementia, where we don't necessarily pay attention to phenotypic or behavioral or cognitive factors, you know, that would require access to some of these technologies that are at present difficult to get. It's still not cheap to get an amyloid test or a positive amyloid scan. And so if there is a risk of autonomy or guardianship in question, you know, that would tend to favor individuals that did have reliable access. If you need both, then that sort of redoubles the efforts. And if you find yourself relying on a purely a behavioral oriented measure of dementia, well, we already see what that does to people of color who are most likely to be treated for their psychiatric symptoms rather than cognitive deficits. So, you know, we have to be very, very thoughtful about making sure that whatever diagnostic criteria that we set, that they're fair and that it is truly accessible for everyone.
So with that, we are a little bit over time. I would like to invite all of our attendees to give a virtual round of applause for our panelists. I think that was an incredibly thoughtful and nuanced conversation about some exciting new technologies, but also some technologies that cause us to revisit important legal and ethical questions around privacy, around consent, around capacity. So thank you very much. This was a real pleasure and a great way to spend a lunch hour.